Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. This is our first Close in Conversation event, and we're literally thrilled that it's Brian Rice and Prue O'Day who are going to kick this off. This wonderful exhibition of Brian's been so well received, and we're really proud to say that it's the first time these prints have all been shown, all 9 of them together. They're heraldic prints that were generated in the 60s, and they were really perceived as lino cuts. We hope that you get a chance to see them later on. So in the making of this exhibition, I had already started working a little bit with Prue O'Day again after knowing her for many, many years in the art world. And it was then that we realised, oh, Prue knows Brian and Brian knows Prue from way back in the 1960s. And we thought that was a lovely, natural progression to inviting them to come and talk to us about themselves and how they feel about the art world and possibly the exhibition. I think they'll actually follow a natural flow. We hope that you'll ask questions afterwards, and everyone will have a lovely, relaxed evening. And join me then in introducing Brian Rice and Prue O'Day.
So Brian, I've got this lovely quote from you, which I thought was a good way to kick off things. I see myself as a painter who makes prints. Several chance circumstances have led to my making lots of prints and teaching printmaking for 30 plus years. So I thought it would be really interesting to go way back and start perhaps when you're at art school, because that was when things really began to change for you.
It did, yes, yeah. Well, I went to Yeovil School of Art, and that was only possible because in the 1940s there were 2 major education acts passed. It was free secondary education for all, and then a bit later free further education for all. And my parents were working class. There's no way they could have afforded to send me to art school, particularly if I was trying to go today. And as it was, my stepmother had to cajole my father into allowing me to go to art school for 4 years. I mean, it was a 4-year course then, and it was called, you did 2 years, which was called the intermediate exam in arts and crafts, and then the National Diploma in Design, which is now recognised as a degree equivalent. I went to Yeovil, and perhaps I should go back a bit further. When I was at Yeovil Grammar School, and I really wasn't very happy at grammar school. I don't know why, I just didn't seem to fit in. And we had an art teacher who was a little old lady, basically, and tried to teach us to do watercolours and, you know, little still lives and things, which didn't interest me. And then when I was in the 4th form, one of my colleagues said to me, in Yeovil School of Art, they had an evening class, after school class. So we finished school at 4, and you could walk down the road into Yeovil and 4:30 and go to the art school. And the minute I walked in there, I just thought, this is where I belong. I just felt so at home, you know, immediately. So when the following year, when it was due to leave school, and everyone was saying to me, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And I said, well, anything I'm any good at's drawing, really. And my father said, oh, you could get a job at Westlands in the drawing office. I thought, well, that's not quite what I thought. And I have this aunt who, perhaps I should explain, my mother died when I was born, so I had a stepmother who was wonderful, but this aunt was her sister, and she'd always taken me under her wing. And, you know, she would take me to London to the Festival of Britain and things like that. She didn't have any children of her own, although she was married and ran a pub in Lyme Regis. So she said to me, well, you could be an architect. And I thought, oh, I like the sound of that. And I had always been interested in architecture, you know, just in a general way. I love and still love Romanesque architecture and, you know, medieval architecture. So she took me along to the art school and said, you know, my nephew wants to be an architect. And Yeovil Art School at that time had 20 full-time students, which was the most they had ever had. And this was 20 students with 2 full-time teachers and about 4 or 5 part-time teachers. Can you imagine that ratio today? And the principal, who was always anxious to get more pupils in, said, well, first of all, I think I had 4 O-levels. He said he would need at least 2 A-levels to go to architectural college. And he couldn't go until he was 18. But if he came here, we could set him a course for a year of architectural studies and, you know, general design, interior design and things like that, which they did. And I spent the first year at art school copying drawings from a big, thick book called Bannister Fletcher's History of Architecture. And no one explained to me, the drawings were all just a bit bigger than a postage stamp, and I copied them with dividers. And no one explained to me that they were all reduced to go in the book, you know. I mean, it's a wonder I didn't go blind. Anyway, that's what I did basically for the whole year, and I enjoyed it, and it was great. But I started to think that all the other students were having a much better time than me, you know, painting and drawing and so on. So after a year, I said I wanted to transfer onto the architectural course, onto the ordinary diploma course. And they said, well, you haven't really had any experience of colour, so we don't think we can let you go on to the painting course. They were right. I mean, I hadn't. And so I had to do a course which was then called illustration. You'd call it graphic design today, but with a subsidiary course of textile printing. And the illustration course involved a lot of printmaking, and the textile course also involved a lot of printmaking because you cut lino blocks and printed them onto textiles. So that was really how I started making mostly lithographs. I loved it. And then I went on and did the next 2 years for my NDD.
And Brian, wasn't that when you did classes in heraldry, which is sort of quite...
Yeah, there was one of the full-time teachers, there was a lady called L.C.K. Kohler, who had been educated at Cheltenham Ladies' College and was RWA. And, you know, she was an absolute whiz at watercolour painting, and she always tried to get us interested, but I just somehow couldn't get the hang of it. You know, watercolour wasn't for me. But she was a fountain of knowledge, and she used to have classes in the evening. By the way, we worked from 9 in the morning to 9 at night, every day except Friday, when we finished at 4:30 or 5, at 5 o'clock, I think. And we all went to the cinema, you know, or the pub. So 4 days, 12-hour days. I mean, there'd be a break for lunch and a break for tea, but and she did these classes in heraldry, and for some reason it really gelled with me. I just really liked all that thing of flags and symbols, and you know, here it is. I mean, this is half of what you're seeing here still, and it still influences my work to this day. And it's something to do with the simple shapes and the simple colours, because in heraldry, the colours are all prescribed, you know, and they're all very definitely a red and a blue or whatever, you know, and lots of black. So that was how that came about, yeah.
So after that, you then came to London briefly, I think, and then the thing that I'm really interested in, Brian was a brilliant cyclist. And
oh, I thought we were going to miss that one.
No, well, I really like the tale, because at one point you went to France to see if you could become a professional cyclist.
Yeah,
In the end, decided not to. And this is a really key moment because you then cycled down to southern Spain to meet Derek Beauchamp
Yes.
with a friend. And then you went to Morocco and spent hours waiting for a lift, hitchhiking, when you became really, really involved and loved drawing.
Yeah,
And it seemed like a really key moment.
It was the pivotal moment for me, really, because to go back to the cycling, I was champion of Yeovil Cycling Club 3 times, and on a club level, I was pretty good. And then I had to do national service, and just before I was due, at the end of a race, this chap came up to me and said, "I'm Captain Harry Keats of the Army Cycling Union, and I gather you're due for national service." And I said, "Yeah, September." And he said, "Well, you'll be posted to my unit at 2 Training Battalion, RASC, and I can promise you all the cycling you can handle for 2 years." And I was literally a professional cyclist for the army. We were given office jobs. They had the best team in the country, and he wanted to make sure we had 1 Olympic gold medalist, and we had 2 or 3 other British international riders. It was really, and at that time, everyone was doing national service, so the army was full of the most brilliant cyclists. It was very, very competitive. And for instance, I broke the army 12-hour record. There's a race where you race for 12 hours, and the person who goes the furthest is on a measured course, is the winner. And I broke the record, and then 20 minutes later, somebody else broke the record, my record. And then half an hour later, a guy called Vin Denson broke our record, and he ended up riding the Tour de France about 18 times and being a domestic for Jacques Anquetil. That's how good people were then. So that was the army. And I was really, had to kind of, if I was going to get any better, I couldn't be an artist. I had to spend more time training, more time. And if I was going to be an artist, I had to give up the cycling. And I'm glad to say I decided to give up the cycling, but that came a little bit later. I've lost the track. What did you say?
You went to Morocco.
Oh, yes.
That's when you got the whole thing of loving drawing and realised you wanted to be an artist.
I went to Goldsmiths and did teacher training for a year after the army. And then you had to teach in a school for a year before you got your certificate. Say you had your art teacher certificate. And I did that in this secondary school in High Wycombe, and I thought, never again. I'd rather sweep the streets than teach in a secondary school, teach art to, they were great kids, and it was not a bad school or anything, but I just thought, I don't want to spend my life doing. And so I thought by that time I was very, very fit, because I lived in London and I used to cycle to High Wycombe and back every day, which is about 90 miles a day, And I thought, I think what I'm going to do is, I gave up the job, go to France and see what chance I've got of making a living racing on the continent, because that's where you have to be, and had to be, and still have, really. And I rode in a few races in France, and the racing was so different to what I was used to, and it was all round the houses. I rode in a race, a nighttime race in Sète, down near Marseille on the coast. And it's a harbour, and as you went round this block, the canal was there, and they were all sort of pushing you out, and you were riding along the edge of the canal in the dark, with the street light every 50 yards or so.
So did you go on from Sète to Spain? So you were sort of almost there.
Well, I then went into Spain, and I thought, well, I'll have a go and see if the racing's any different in Spain. But then I got Spanish tummy, and so I lost my fitness. And I'd had Derek Beauchamp, who you may have heard of, has been my long-standing friend. We were both at Yeovil Art School together. And he'd said to me, well, if you come into Spain, we're going to be staying in Fuengirola, which was a fishing village then, and why don't you come down and, you know, see us and stay with us? So I didn't cycle all the way. I put my bike on the train and went right down there, and he and the other artist friend, Peter Jones, had a little exhibition in a cafe in Fuengirola. And he said, well, just go in there and ask for the English artists. So I did, and had a drink or two, and they didn't turn up, and I had another drink or two, and they still didn't turn up. And the guy said to me about 3 o'clock, he said, oh, we're closing now. He said, but you can stay and wait for your friends. So I went to sleep on this bench. The next thing I remember, Derek waking me up, you know, and saying, oh, here you are. And he said, oh, we're going to Morocco tomorrow. So I said, oh, right. So I cycled to Gibraltar and left my bicycle in the Toc H in Gibraltar, which I knew was a safe place to leave it. And we got on the boat and went over to Morocco, and we hitchhiked down to the Sahara Desert, stopping off at Tangier and Marrakesh and places like that. We actually went as far as you can go. You have to have a permit to go into the desert. And whilst we were on the way hitchhiking, it was, you always got a lift, but sometimes you had to wait 3 or 4 hours for a car or a van to come along. You know, there was very little traffic, but whatever came nearly always would give you a lift. And the cars were always sort of massive American cars, so there were plenty of room for 3. But whilst we were sitting, we had some really wrapping paper, really, and just pencils and pens. And we used to mix the sand with the water to get a bit of colour, and did these drawings in the desert. And it was sitting there and all that time of thinking, and I just suddenly, you know, I thought, this is what I really want to do. And I don't really care what I have to do to support myself. I'll do anything. You know, sweep the streets if I have to, in order to earn enough to keep me as an artist. So I came, we did Morocco and came back, and I cycled home from Gibraltar to my parents' house in Montacute, and my parents ran a village shop and off license in Montacute. And I stayed there a year. My father had a big shed that he'd had battery hens in, and he'd given it up because it was getting to be not a nice thing to do. And so I had this big shed, and I did a whole lot of paintings. I worked as a gardener for various people, including the vicar of West Coker, looking after the graveyard at West Coker, where the grass was this high, and I'd try and find the graves. And it was a great summer, and I got a lot of paintings together, and then I decided, well, the only way I'm going to get anyone to exhibit these is to go back to London and try and find a gallery.
So this is the beginning of the 60s?
This was 1961.
Right.
Yeah.
So a couple of years before these. These were
60.
Yeah.
Well, I came up to London in late 61. No, actually, it was January 62, I think. That's right. And I had a bed sit in Barons Court. And I eventually, after a month or two, I managed to rent a studio space above a shop just up near Olympia. And it was within walking distance. And I started doing all these sort of paintings. Now, you know, it's difficult to remember exactly why you did that. But first of all, I had this background and this interest in heraldry because the paintings I'd made at Montacute were nothing like this. And they're in the book. You can see they were very textured and very landscape-based and slightly figurative.
So there was a huge change in coming to the city.
Yeah, it was as if just, something changed in me. And I started looking at all the road signs and particularly the underground sign, you know. I mean, they're so in your face, aren't you? It's hard to miss them. And I as I say, I started doing these paintings, and I didn't have a press, I didn't have anything to make prints. And I just cut these shapes, you know, the U shape, the comb shape, the V shape, out of lino. And I printed them with a spoon, you know, with the back of a spoon. And I did them on very thin Japanese paper. It was it had to be to get the ink to come through, you know. And I did the whole series. And I did have a show of them in London in a place called the Shelley Gallery in Islington, or Camden Town, I think it was. Well, it was between the two. And didn't sell any, you know, but can I tell them?
In those days.
Peter O'Toole came along to the show, and I had a friend from Bristol who'd known Peter O'Toole when he was in Rep or at Bristol, and he said, he lives just around the corner, shall I ask him to come? So I said, yeah, great. You know, I said, famous, but he'll buy, you know. Did he hell? He came in with his wife and family, plonked himself on the plan chest, stayed there. It was very amusing for, you know, an hour and a half, I should think, till all the wine was gone, of course, and then he disappeared, didn't buy a thing. So I have shown them, but they were it was a little room, you know, about as big as this. And so I'm not even sure I got all of them on the wall. And I have subsequently shown 2 or 4 in various exhibitions around, but I've never been able to show them all together like this. So.
Fantastic opportunity. Great. So anyway, you arrived in London at the height of the swinging 60s.
Yeah.
And we met because I was working at London Graphic Arts.
Yes,
which was
yes.
a print publisher who was sort of like this wonderful gift to London and was buying so many prints from young artists and selling them all at universities in America. Yeah. And actually around the country here, because what was different then was there was funding. The local councils bought...
Well, the museums had money to buy things,
And local councils often bought them and had print loan schemes.
Yeah.
So it was the most wonderful way of getting income to artists. And so many painters started making prints. And it was a really fantastic time for prints to really expand beyond...
And they were cheap, that was the other thing.
£10.
Yeah.
£15.
Yeah.
And they were always in addition, was it 70, after 70, I think, there was purchase tax, which is why that low number.
Yeah.
Except abroad.
Yes. But,
so you were super cool, and I just arrived from Australia into this amazing city, and I couldn't believe my luck in getting my first job in the art world.
Yes.
And, you know, mixing with artists. And Brian, you were just there with all the sort of fashion world, the film world, and just, you know, carrying it off with aplomb. Yeah. And anyway, tell us a bit about what you experienced in London, and also the impact of Eugene Schuster, you and so many other artists.
Well, the first thing to remember is all of these working class kids that had benefited from these 2 education acts finally had gone to art school and had just come out of art school at the beginning of the 60s. So all your David Hockneys and your Alan Joneses and all those people, you know, they were all just hit the market, as it were. And I once did a little talk for BBC 4, and it was called Art School. And it was about people who went to art school in the 50s and what happened to them in the 60s. And I said, I didn't have any time to rehearse this, but, you know, I would have perhaps phrased it better, but I said, we thought we were changing the world. But of course, all we were really changing was the way it looked a little bit. And, you know, meaning that all the art dealers were still the same, you know, all the critics, all the people that controlled your career. We were just another batch of artists to exploit, frankly. But
there was huge energy. It was unbelievable.
It was. I mean,
to the visual happened in the 60s.
Yeah.
You know, before people were just not so visually aware. It didn't excite them, but it was an extraordinary time.
And I don't know whether it was actually any money about, but people felt good. You know, I mean, there was that thing. And as Prue says, prints were very cheap. And that was my motivation for making prints, so that I could reach a lot of people with my images, you know.
It was such a good way for artists to become known.
Yeah.
And, you know, and there were two editions of Electo were really important.
Yes,
they were doing
yes.
prints with people like Hockney and Alan Jones, and then in America it was Gemini, GEL, and so it became this really exciting medium. And through it, your work really developed a lot. Well,
Eugene Schuster came along. I just stopped for a moment. I did also then in '64 have a show. Well, I had two shows, '64 and '65, with a very avant-garde gallery called the New Vision Centre, and it was just about the only gallery in London that was dedicated to abstract art. And Dennis Bowen, God bless his soul, took on. So a lot of people like Peter Blake and Joe Tilson had their first ever shows at the New Vision Centre. It never made any money, it just about stayed solvent. But Dennis, you know, I mean, he showed Fontana, and I mean, people from Italy, all over Europe. I mean, he was, and I was reading about Audrey Edwards, a black Jamaican artist, just in Tate magazine. Well, Dennis showed him in, you know, late 50s, and he was just so open-minded about art, and he was what they called a tachist painter at the time. You know, a sort of dribble Jackson Pollock sort of thing. Jackson Pollock came along 10 years later, but anyway, so that was, you know, I had two very good shows with Dennis, and I have a story about this. I just love it so much, I must tell you. I knew a girl, I had a girlfriend, not girlfriend, but knew a girl who worked at the BBC. And she was Jimmy Young's girlfriend. Everyone remembers Jimmy Young, I'm sure. And he was on the radio every day, but he had two girlfriends. He had a weekday girlfriend and a weekend girlfriend. I never quite worked out which one she was, but I think she must have been the weekend one, because she worked at the BBC. And she said to me, when I was having my show at the New Vision Centre, my second show, and she said, Jimmy Young buys art, you know, he's very keen on art. Shall I ask him to come along? And I said, yeah, great, you know. So he came, and I was introduced to him, and he was very charming, and he stood around for a bit, and it was very busy, and suddenly he was gone. And I met her a bit later, and I know she was in my pottery class. I used to teach pottery. And I said, well, Jimmy obviously wasn't impressed by my work that much. And she said, oh, he seems to like it. You know, I said, well, what does he collect then? And she thought for a minute, and she said, mostly Cézannes. So I thought, yeah, okay.
So I was thinking we could then move on to the time, the way the painting and the prints were changing.
Yes, well, Eugene came. When did Eugene come to London?
Must have been in about 64, I think.
Yes. I think it was about 65 or 66. Yeah, and this lady called Judy Stapleton, who incidentally had been Dennis Bowen's wife, rang me and said, I've got this American dealer who's buying prints to take back to London. Can I come and so she bought 8 prints for me, cash, you know. Oh, I thought, this is a good idea. And then Eugene, eventually I got to meet Eugene, and he was doing something at Oxford University, wasn't he?
No, he was at the Warburg, I think, in London.
Oh,
he was
right.
Studying, yeah.
He was studying history of art, yes. And he decided that the prints in England were very cheap, and there was a huge talent of printmaking, that he could buy them up, take them back to America in the holidays and sell them and finance himself, you know, to live in London. And that's how he started. But then when he finished this course, came from Detroit, I think, didn't he? Yes. He went back to Detroit and he came up with this idea that why couldn't you sell prints like you sold everything else? You know, I mean, prints are a commodity. And this is, you know, this American idea of why do you have to be precious and why do you have to go in a gallery and sort of have posh people telling you how wonderful that, you know, just sell them to people. So he had this fleet of estate cars, I think, wasn't it? In America. Guys, salesmen with estate cars driving around America doing whistle-stop exhibitions. And they were mostly in colleges and universities. And they would drive into, they'd arrange in advance, you know, to do a show. They would drive into town. And the prints weren't framed, they were in acetate, weren't they? So he could just clip them up on the wall, you know, they obviously had something they could do. Go down the town and buy some booze and some nibbles, you know, and sell. And when people came to this private view, they would do the old, you know, hard sell. And the university would, of course, buy some and they'd give them some for their collection, which is why I've got a great CV of American universities and offices and things that have my prints. And he literally changed the lives of, I would say, 15 to 20 artists in England. Yeah. People who, you know, were recognised printmakers and maybe taught at the Slade or somewhere like that. But, you know, you just, if it was left to you, you weren't going to sell very many. And he just commissioned editions. And by about 66, I think it was, he put me on a contract. And he paid me £100 a month, and which in 1966 was more than most people were earning at ordinary jobs, you know. And in return, I would agree to do certain editions, you know, design a certain number of prints a year, so that. And he did his prints in 3 sizes. I always remember they were this big, you know, and then this big. And the little ones he called student prints?
I'd forgotten that.
and you know, they sold for like £3 each or something, or $3 or whatever it was in America. Yeah. So and I didn't have to print them. He commissioned a screen printer in London to print all the work for him. So they were, you know, beautiful prints. They were all beautifully printed, and you would just go and supervise, make sure the colours were right, and then, of course, you had to sign them, and off they'd go to America. And that went on for a few years, didn't it?
Yeah.
He had initially had an office with a sort of gallery space in Grosvenor Street. And then he got the gallery in New Bond Street. And he had a really classy gallery there.
Now we're doing old master prints.
Yes, the other thing, which was very cunning, he used to go to auction and buy old master prints, and sometimes they needed restoration, which Prue's now husband used to do for him.
No, he was a friend of the husband. Phil Stevens did, yeah.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
I thought Don did.
No.
I thought he was the restorer.
No, that was Phil.
Right, confused.
Yeah.
Anyway, he'd have them restored, but he did lots and lots of advertising. And the other thing that he did, he would put all of his artists in alphabetical order. So in the adverts, it would say like Picasso, Braque, Rouault, Rice. You know, I mean, he just mixed all his...
Rembrandt, too.
Rembrandt, yeah. And endless, I've got endless ads, you know, clippings of this sort of thing. And he produced catalogues.
He did.
Yeah. And he did a lot of leaflets as well with the same thing. You know, there'd be a Braque here and a Brian Rice there and I can't, and just muddled them all up. I mean, the prices were different, but, you know, it was like that was irrelevant, really. So it was a big operation. And that ran on to about 1972, I think, for me.
And through that period, your work was beginning to change. It was becoming much more geometrical, crowded.
Well, I was painting at the same time, and I have to say that the paintings and the prints were like that. You know, they just crossed over, and sometimes I'd do an idea for a print, and I think, I think if I change that a bit, because the paintings were 4 foot square. Acrylics had been invented by then. That was the other great breakthrough.
Yeah.
And not only been invented, but they started to get really as good as oil paint, or nearly as good. They're never quite as good as oil paint, in my opinion, but they're more practical. And so, you know, I was painting and having income from these prints. And the other thing that I haven't got round to mentioning was that when I was at Goldsmiths College doing my teacher training, I met on the course was a lady called Jennifer Dixon, who, I'm not sure she's still alive, actually. She was a bit old. But anyway, she became an RA, and she was very influential, but she was head of printmaking at Brighton. And she was very, I don't know, not strict isn't the right word, but very straight. And a lot of people didn't like her very much, but I got on with her. I respected her for, you know, and she was always top of the class at Goldsmiths. You know, wrote the best essay, did the best that. And then out of the blue, I get a telephone call from her and saying, Brian, I wonder if you'd like to come down to Brighton to teach screen printing to the foundation course. And I had been earning a living teaching pottery at Evening Institute, which was wonderful because I taught one afternoon and three or four evenings a week. So I could paint all day, you know, and then go and teach pottery in the evenings. And so I went down there and I said to her, oh, would you like me to bring some work? And she said, yeah, I think that would be nice, you know, yeah, bring some work. And I said, well, you know, am I going to have an interview? Oh, yes, I'll arrange it. I mean, I had the job. She told me I had the job. So I went down there and walked in, and she said, oh, come with me. And she took me up and she introduced me to the principal, who was called Cowan. He was a great friend of Graham Sutherland's, Dick Cowan, etcher, and the vice principal. And he came over and he said, hello, I hear you're coming to teach with us. So that was my interview. and I taught at Brighton 32 years. But I made this rule early on that I wouldn't do more than 2 days a week teaching. And of course, part-time teaching in art school was quite lucrative. And I could live on that, you know, and I relied on selling work and so on to make up any shortfall. So I taught at Brighton for 32 years, and I just had this thing in my head that it was all right for an artist to teach 2 days a week, but if it became 3 or 4, you were a teacher who painted at weekends, you know, and I didn't want to do that. Unfortunately, thanks to Eugene Schuster and a few other people, I didn't need to. But I stayed there because I loved it at Brighton, and I liked teaching printmaking much more than teaching painting, because occasionally I went in the painting studios and you walk around and there's moody students there, you know, and say, what are you doing? You know, well, I won't do that, you know. But in printmaking, they needed you. I mean, we had technicians, especially towards the end, but they needed your help. You know, if they were doing an etching, you say, you know, this is all, what's gone wrong here? You know, it's all going fuzzy. So you could help them, and in that way you could discuss the work, the content of the work as well. So it was, you were busy all the time, and in the painting studio, you know, they used to go to the pub half the time because they didn't know what to do. You know, they'd go around the studios for an hour, come back, And it just was never quite the same. So I stayed teaching printmaking by accident, really. But
and during that period, the course changed quite a lot, didn't it?
Well, yes, absolutely.
So what was it? Because I remember reading in Andrew Lambert's book, I think, that there was some way, I'm just trying to think if I've got it written down here, basic visual research, this new course.
Well, yes. Victor Pasmore and Harry Thubron, and they started this course up in, do you remember where it was? In Newcastle. Durham. In basic visual research. And it was really going back to the Bauhaus and you know, examining the making of art from the beginning, from like learning the alphabet. And when after a few years of teaching at Brighton, teaching printmaking, suddenly they asked me if I would go into the foundation course and teach, because they didn't really know what it was, and they sussed that I knew what it was. So I taught that to foundation students for quite a few years, and I sort of designed my own course, really, because there was one little book about it, and that was it. But that was good for me as well, because it took me back to my roots and the roots of what I still work from now, which is basically my influences come from Malevich, Kandinsky, the Russian constructivists, and then the Bauhaus. And there had been 2 major Bauhaus exhibitions in London in the early 60s. There was one early and one mid. Yeah. And that was very influential as well. So the work was, you know, kind of, it wasn't constructive. I mean, if you look for me on Wikipedia, it says not part of the pop art music, associated with the pop art movement. Well, I was, because everyone I knew in London was a bloody pop artist, you know, all my friends were...
You tried it briefly, didn't you? You went back.
I tried it for a fortnight, and I thought,
But it must have been quite hard, Brian, with everything else going on. You know,
well, it was, yeah, and of course all the shows, everyone was, you know, they were all, Hockney, Bosher, Alan Jones, they were all getting in all these pop art shows. And the other thing I was never quite sure about was the system painters, the situation painters, who were very controlled. You know, you had to sort of come up with a formula and stick to it. And I didn't. I thought, why should I? You know, I mean, I'm supposed to be my own. So I never quite fitted into any group. But you know, in the end, I think
you had a lot of fun.
I had a lot of fun. Oh, well, we can't go into that. There isn't time.
So now we're going through the 60s, and then in the early 70s, you decided to move back to Somerset.
Yeah.
And that
I had
a pivotal moment.
I bought my first house in 1972 in Lyme Regis, a little cottage in Lyme Regis, from my aunt, who had got me into art school in the first place. And she'd had a pub in Lyme. Her husband had died. She'd given up the pub, but they'd bought 3 cottages next to Long in Mill Green, if you know Lyme Regis. And one of them became empty, so I bought it from her. And I started coming down every summer, because when you were teaching at art school in those days, there were no talks and conferences and all that stuff you had to go to. You just had 3 months off in the summer, you know, boom, boom. And so I'd go to Lyme Regis, and after a few years, I thought, I don't really want to go back to London, I don't think, you know. And I met up with someone in London. Well, actually, no, I met her in Lyme Regis, and she said she was looking for a cottage in Lyme Regis, or in West Dorset. And in the end, we bought a farm together at Askerswell on the far side of Bridport, between Bridport and Dorchester. But that's, it's a bit later on. I just had kind of had enough of London somehow. And the art market Eugene had closed the gallery by then, and all the print galleries were closing. The other thing was that the print market started to get a bit nasty, and there were quite a few dealers going around who were commissioning prints. I mean, I knew one guy who had actually worked for Eugene, and he'd gone to the Bradford Print Biennale, jotted down the names of, I found 18 artists, commissioned prints from them, including me, took them to America and never paid for them. And that was the money that was going to buy my cottage, actually. And I had a bit of a struggle to find it in the end. But so it was, there were people like that. And I had another run-in with an American who ran something called the Print Club of America. Do you remember him?
Yeah.
I can't remember his name now. But Ed Newman, I shouldn't be saying, I might be lying. And he had seen my screen prints, and he said, I'd like you to do a suite of lithographs for me, sort of based on these screen prints. But because they were lithographs, they were going to be printed by the Kirwan Press, which are the best lithographic printers in England. And when I went up there, there were Alan Davies lying around, and Barbara Hepworth and Henry Moores and all this. And I just thought, I don't care, I want to work and do prints with the Kirwan Press. Anyway, we agreed on 6, and we did edition 4 of them, and the other 2 we fell out because he wanted to change the colours. And I said, no, those are my colours, I'm the artist. And he puffed on his big cigar and he said, Brian, I'm paying for these fucking things. I can have what fucking colours I want. And I said, no, you can't, actually. So we did 4, but, it was lovely doing these editions of lithographs, which went to America. Never been seen since. They do crop up sometimes on eBay. So there was a lot of that going on, and it was all getting a bit
disillusioned.
Yeah, the fun was going out of it, really.
So you then spent the next years being a farmer.
Yeah. I was still teaching at Brighton. I carried on teaching at Brighton till 2001. But the rest of the time, with this friend, we bought a 50-acre farm, which had been a sheep farm, and all the facilities were there, the sheep dip and all that stuff. And the guy who I bought it from was a lovely guy who had been the manager of the Hampstead Theatre Club, the theatre club in Hampstead. And they'd read Thomas Hardy, him and his wife. His wife was a ballet dancer. And they thought, oh, we'll go to Dorset and be sheep farmers. And they managed it for about 10 years, I have to say. Never had any money. But anyway, eventually they decided to sell up, so we bought it. But the agreement was that he could carry on with his sheep there for another year, which suited me, because then I could watch what he was doing and what I thought he was doing wrong and what he was doing right and so on. So I kind of learned, and I made all the contacts, and I became a sheep farmer. And I got up to a flock. I had a flock of about 150 with ewes and lambs and so on. And, it was something else. I mean, I come from a background, my father and grandfather were farm labourers in their own farms. But, growing up in Tintagel, farming was all around you. So I felt really at home, and I loved it. And I always had the intention of painting again. And I converted some old Shippens into a studio, nice new studio. And I did 6 paintings, I think. I was doing about 2 a year. And then my partner decided she'd had enough and wanted to go back to London. So we sold up. And I bought the house where I'm living now, which I've been at for, I think, something like 40 years. So that was the sheep, but I slowly got back into exhibiting, and I didn't exhibit for 15 years. And then one day I had started painting again and got some work together, and I went to the meeting house in Ilminster when Jim and Mary Atherton opened it, and full of promise, and they had 2 shows there, and Mary came up to me and said, well, Brian, when are you going to have a show? And by which time I had rather a lot of work, past work and present work. So I had my first exhibition, again, I can't remember the date, but at the meeting house in Ilminster, and then I started showing in art venues, what are they called? Art centres.
Art centre. And the work now was being very influenced by the landscape and your interest in archaeology.
Yeah.
It changed a lot.
Yes.
Yeah.
I had a great experience at the place was called Naller's Farm, where I had all the sheep. And I found quite a lot of interesting archaeology there, including some shards of Bronze Age pottery. And I took them into Dorchester Museum, and they said, and they came out, and archaeologists came, and they scheduled the site, which means that if you want to do anything, build there, you have to pay for the archaeology, And so I got to know the archaeologists when they were digging the car park, the Waitrose car park in the middle of Dorchester. And of course there was Roman remains there. And it now transpires part of a prehistoric circle, a huge prehistoric circle that went miles around Dorchester. And so I just really got interested in archaeology, and all the work that I did then up until 2014 was all based on archaeology in various ways. I was looking at aerial photographs of archaeological sites and sort of abstracting them and making work from that, and from prehistoric rock art. And there's hardly any in the south of England, but in the north of England, in Ireland, and in Europe, there's lots and lots of it, and it's all abstract. It's all circles and shapes, and it was just beginning to be known, and people were starting to publish books about it, and universities were doing digs, and a lot of them on huge boulders. I mean, I went to the west coast of Ireland, well, twice actually, because there was a lot there. And I read in a book about this hillside where all this rock art was to be found. And I walked around on this hillside, and there were all these big slabs of rock, but I couldn't see a thing. And I said, what are they kidding, And then as the afternoon went on and the sun dropped down and you got the right angle, you could see all these amazing patterns and things described in the rocks. And they had been preserved by peat because since prehistoric times, the land had been covered in peat, and then the Irish had gradually dragged off all the peat to burn, so it was being revealed again. And it was just a fascinating thing for me. So I did that for a long time. And then by chance in 2013 or 14, and I was just saying to Prue before we started, we opened our studios for Dorset Art Week, and this guy drifted in, and he knew everything about me. He knew all my paintings, he knew everything that had come up for auction, and he'd say, oh, I put a bid on that, but I didn't get it, and so on. And he said, what London gallery are you showing? And I said, well, I'd had a show with a lovely guy called Chris Stevens, quite a small gallery, and of 60s sort of drawings, studies and things, and a few prints, and I think even a couple of these. And he had to leave his gallery because the landlord doubled the rent, and he kept emailing me and said, "Oh, I think I found another place." And 2 years had gone by, and I said to this chap, I said, "Well, I haven't got a London gallery right now." And he said, "Would you like me to see if I can find you one?" And he was a sort of art wheeler dealer. You know, he didn't have his own gallery, but he bought and sold. And so he rang me from time to time and said, "What do you think of this gallery?" or "What do you think of that gallery?" You know. And then one day he rang up and he said, "I've taken your work." I had a catalogue because I had a retrospective exhibition when I retired from Brighton in 2001, and they did a very nice catalogue for me. So he'd taken that in and shown the people in the Redfern Gallery, and he said, "What do you think?" You know, he said, they're interested in giving you a show. And I said, ever since I first went to London, my dream was to have a show at the Redfern Gallery, you know. It was just iconic, really, and still is, I think. You know, everything's changed a lot. But so in 2014, I had a show of all my 60s work in the Redfern Gallery, and they sold almost everything. It was phenomenal. And afterwards, when I stepped back, I mean, you know, it was great because it's given me a pension and all that sort of thing, but I felt I was probably a bit exploited because I thought it was so successful that they would go on, you know, have me on their books and give me future shows. But they had specifically said, "We're only interested in the work from 1959 to 1970. And that's what they sold. So, you know, that's the end of that. But and I've often found this, that having a show, when I had my retrospective at Brighton, it was another occasion, and you get a chance to sit back or stand back and look at your own work, and you think, God, you know, it's not as good as I thought it was, really, or you know, and this happened at the Redfern Gallery, and you know, all that, everyone writing about my 60s work, and they did a lovely catalogue. And I thought there were so many things that I use the term youthful enthusiasm, you know, that I just raced on from one painting to the next and not really quite thinking, well, maybe if I develop that a bit more, you know, and so I started again. I abandoned all the archaeological work, which I had started to sort of feel I was becoming a bit repetitive, you know, and I just started again, and that's where I am now. I'm gone back to the Bauhaus, the constructivism, and you know, just making work.
The wheel's gone full circle.
Yeah, yeah.
There's also a really interesting tale about this painting, isn't there, and the dealer who came in and swept away.
Well, as I said at the beginning, these paintings I did in this shop in right next to Olympia, and I did a whole lot of them, but when I moved to my current house, it was a ruin, and the roof was leaking, and every penny I had, I'd paid. I bought it from Ford Abbey, and I'd given them all the money I had. And so, you know, to do any repairs, it was only when I earned the money I could do it, sort of thing. And this guy rang me one day, a lovely old man called Laurie Stewart, and he said, "You're an artist, aren't you?" I know what it was. I'd advertised a whole lot of copies of Arts Review.
Yeah.
What was the rather posh one?
Studio International?
Studio International, that's right. And he'd seen the advert, and he said, "Oh, I'll buy the magazines." You know, he said, "I'll have those." And he said, it was in the very early days of computers. I can't kind of quite remember the date, but he said, "I can't find anything about you online." I said, "I don't even know what online means," you know. I mean, really, you know, that early. And he had started an online gallery. And he said, I do buy art, you know. So he came down from London with his wife, and they bought 3,000 quid's worth of paintings, you know, this and that and everything, which, how long? I said I'd been 40 years, so this was 40 years ago, you know, I just hadn't been there very long. And it was incredibly useful money, and he came 3 or 4 times and spent that sort of money and maybe more. And JC and I went to London a couple of times, took work up to him because he was so old he couldn't drive. His wife had to drive him. And at one point he said to me, what else have you got? You know, and I said, well, there's a roll of canvases in the attic that I'd taken off the stretchers to reuse the stretchers, which was these paintings. And I said, I can't go up there scrabbling about now. He said, no, I'll come again. So next time, he bought this roll of canvases. And as he was going, I said, look, I think I ought to keep one. So I'd kept this one. and the rest of them, he always called himself a dealer, but he was really a hoarder. and when we went to his house, well, he'd had this house in North London on the North Circular, but it got so full of art that he couldn't live there anymore. And he'd bought a cottage out in the country, and he just had racks and racks. And occasionally he would put one in auction, and even now 1 or 2 of mine, just before last October, 3 of mine that I'd sold to him came up for auction at Mallon's. And this must be his wife now, because I think he's dead. And, you know, they're still there. But this one, and the other thing is, the embarrassing thing about the title, and I can't remember what it's called. Yeah, the something Buddha of time past. I mean, they're just so unwieldy, the titles. They're just unbelievable. Oh, my God. I'm going to take ages to find it.
Do you remember it, Freeney? Freeney will find it.
No, I've got it. It's here.
The creation of Buddha. The
creation of the Buddha of time past. And it was just so happened I read this book on Zen Buddhism, you know, and I thought, yeah, that's it. So all of these paintings have got all these ridiculous titles to them. Which reminds me about these paintings, they're all the titles are Japanese. And my Japanese knowledge of Japanese came from a Sunday Times colour supplement where there was a page saying, find your way around Japan, you know. and so all the things say, to the right, to the left, straight ahead. and some friend's Japanese girlfriend came and read them once, and she laughed her head off, and I think they were all completely wrong anyway. But it's been a nightmare because no one ever spells them correctly, you know, and they've got like a word like Achira A with just an E on the end, and think someone's, oh, you know, there can't be a gap there. So they're always getting the wrong title. But,
well, I think this is a really good time now. I think, Brian, you've covered so much. I hope everyone's found it interesting. It's just been an extraordinary life. And the way you've managed to, whenever there's an opportunity, there's been a change and a change in the work. And I just think we've got a few minutes if anyone wants to ask any questions to wrap things up.
Have you asked me all your questions? Yeah.
I think you've covered it beautifully. Oh, I suppose one thing we could talk about the difference between art schools now and then.
Oh, God.
So that's a long story.
I mean, you know, I said at the beginning, this idea that an art school could exist in Yeovil with 24 students. They had people coming in for evening classes and things. And that number of teachers is just unbelievable now, isn't it? And the fact that there were small art schools in every... You know, there must have been 6 or 7 or 8 in Somerset. Oh, what's that? You know, and they're all gone.
Yeah.
And now the idea that you have to pay, what is it, 9,000 quid or something to do a course?
Yeah, we've all got to fight for the creativity to stay on the curriculum. I mean, it's awful.
Yes.
Yeah, it's really sad.
I mean, of course, going to a grammar school, I didn't get a very good art education because all they were interested in was getting students into Oxford and Cambridge. But, you know, there's still such a lack. It's the same with music, you know. It's just so sad, really, that people like me, you know, wouldn't get a chance anymore, I don't think. Unless, unless you've got middle-class parents who can come up with the money. I don't know how they do it.
I think, unfortunately, that's the case increasingly. It's just really, it's such a waste of, there's so much talent in this country.
Yeah.
And we've just...
Oh, by the way, the Tate Gallery have got 2 of these prints, 2 down there. And on the website, for years, this one, the 4th one along, don't ask me what it's called, and it was sideways on their website. And I kept thinking, I must do something about it. And about a month ago, I finally thought, I must do something. And I got on the website, and it was not easy to find, but the only thing I could email was the shop. and I sort of wrote an email and said, you have in your print collection 2 of my prints, and one of them is sideways. Could you? And someone did actually get back to me from the print department, and they've changed it. And finally it's the right way around. But yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
So there we have a question down there. Now, how do we do this with the microphone? Can you stand up?
With such a full life, Brian, is there anything you didn't do that you think you regret?
No, I'm not Frank Sinatra. Well, I think if I was starting again, I might be an archaeologist. I'm still fascinated by archaeology, and I do. You've got a moth in here. Look, it's on the wall.
Not an architect, someone has said.
No, not an architect. Definitely not an architect. What put me off about being an architect was, first of all, you always have to work in a team, and I don't think I'm a very good team person. And also the working out, the geometry and the mathematics, which was just about my weakest subject at school. No, archaeology would be, if for some reason I couldn't make paintings, I would do that.
What's next in the pipeline, Brian Rice?
What is?
What's next in the pipeline?
I've no idea. I've no idea. I'm supposed to be having the odd show here and there. I have I had a gallery in St Ives, which closed during COVID, and he said to me, not just the COVID thing, but the business rates had just really put him out of business. But he said 70% of my business now is online. And he's moved up to a farm up the hill, 2 miles up the hill out of St Ives, and he's still dealing and he's still having shows online. And, he does a lot of mixed shows. So there's one, not the current one, Sven Berlin, which I hate. And the one after that, I think I've got some work in that. And, things happen. I mean, I've got to the age now that I just don't have the energy to paint and go chasing around after exhibitions and, talking to people. But things seem to turn up, so.
They certainly do. Well, I think this exhibition is just a fantastic piece.
Well, Freeney, this is an opportunity to thank her. She's done a fantastic job. She's got a lovely gallery.